For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttners View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Now, both the EFF and NUMSA have brought the Freedom Charter back into public debate, while the ANC continues to see it as a foundational document. Do you see this as an important contribution to debate?
You know, I've worked on the Freedom Charter for a long time, and I always have to rethink why it's important, because there's a tendency to see a document like the Freedom Charter as something of biblical significance, that all you need to do is read it, and then there'll be a revelation, and then we'll have all the answers to the problems of South Africa. And I don't think the Freedom Charter is meant to be treated that way. It was drafted after consultation all over the country with a range of people. It was adopted in 1955, and we are now in almost in 2015. And what I think it means is that you have to interpret a document like the Freedom Charter in the context of the times in which we live. Now, in America, there was a famous jurist, Benjamin Cardozo, who said, "The great generalities of the American Constitution have a meaning and significance that vary from age to age." Now, maybe many people will not agree that the American Constitution is so great. However, the principle that he's applying, I think, is important, is that you can't, the Freedom Charter is not something whose meaning is obvious. Now, it's been introduced by the EFF and NUMSA in very specific contexts, in regard to the land question and in regard to the wealth. But I think it's important to understand the character of the document and not see it as purely applicable to one or other sphere of life. Because when they went to collect demands all over the country, if you go to Wits Library, in the special collections, the archive section, you can see scanned versions of the handwritten demands on scraps of paper, the backs of cigarette boxes, torn out pages of school exercise books. People made demands about aspects of their lives. Now, some of these demands were directly related to workers or directly related to the land. Because for many people, as Wilson Fanti says, the land is the first question. But other people who I've interviewed in a book that I did with Jeremy Cronin, Billy Nair says, it's in the first place, it's a working class orientated document. But when you say it's working class orientated, it doesn't mean that it's purely for the working class, because the document, Freedom Charter, is in the first place a people's document or a popular document. It speaks, it's not written like a constitution. It's not written with the precision of a legal document, because it heard what people said in a number of different places. And these demands, people who went around this, what were called the Freedom Volunteers, they went around and they were told to write down exactly what people said or collect what they had written, not to sit there doctoring what they said. And these demands from all over the place, sometimes they were eccentric. Someone might have said, I want to have as many wives as I want, or something like that. Now, the object of the charter was not to, you couldn't record every single person's demands. You had to take from those demands, when they drafted it, their job was not to rewrite what people said, but they couldn't include every single person's demand. They had to ask what were common demands. Now, in the first place, the Freedom Charter reacts to apartheid. So people want an end to discrimination. But then they phrase it as demands, like the first clause says, the people shall govern. They want the vote. And so the Freedom Charter is a consensus document, but what the meaning of a consensus document will be is something that depends on the weight of the various forces. In other words, there are references to women's rights. Now, at that time, there wasn't, or let's say at this time, there may be much more weight behind gender equality because it's now a constitutional right. I'm not sure that it's the organized weight. So how the Charter will be interpreted depends on the weight of various constituencies. The fact that EFF and NUMSA have raised it and the ANC continues to do it is interesting, but I think it's important that we should encourage people to look at the document in a critical way, engage with it, not worship it.
How do you understand NUMSA's statement that the Freedom Charter should be implemented in full?
See, I wonder what they have in mind. And my guess is that they are focusing on their interpretation of the wealth shall be shared. Now, the thing about implementing in full is that the Freedom Charter is a document for national liberation, not just for the working class, and not just to do with wealth, but to do with human dignity wherever it is disrupted, whether through attacks on gender-based violence or sexually based violence. Now, there's not, at that stage, people are not so aware of sexualities. But if you take the spirit of the Freedom Charter, you can develop it to say that given the spirit of the Freedom Charter, it would be in line with these sections of the Constitution. I think it's important that, well, NUMSA, for example, is aware of the importance of the rural areas. They did give evidence against the Traditional Courts Bill, so they are aware of it. But when they say implement in full, I think they really have in mind, first of all, macroeconomic policy, that South Africa persists in what they call a neoliberal policy. Now, my answer to the question, what do they mean, is that it's important that they understand that the Freedom Charter addresses the working class, but not just the working class alone. It also addresses an emerging capitalist class and says that all sorts of openings have got to be created for people to trade, go into business. Now, it's important that we look at that in the context of the needs of all. The fact that you have the emergence of black bourgeoisie mainly through access to the state, not all of them, but mainly through access to the state. Now, what is the consequences of that? When you accumulate your wealth through access to the state, that has a tendency to lead to irregularities and diversion of funds which could go for the poor. So what I feel is when we say we address the Freedom Charter, we can't ignore clauses that encourage freedom of trade, but then we have to ask ourselves, how does that get regulated in a way that does not enrich the few at the expense of the welfare of the poor?
Well, thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the Freedom Charter.